3 days before my wedding, my father refused to walk me down the aisle just to appease my sister's ego. My mother told me to walk alone and stop the drama. Little did they know, their cruelty was the catalyst I needed. I walked, but not how they expected. Before I go on, please take a moment to like and subscribe. But only if you genuinely connect with this story. Drop a comment and let me know where you are watching from and what time it is there. I always love knowing who's listening. My name is Adisa Lozada, 32 years old, and my life has been defined by the silent, crushing weight of being the shadow in my own family's narrative. My sister Clara was always the sun, and I was merely the dark space where her brilliance couldn't reach. Growing up, every achievement of mine was eclipsed by her dramatic whims, and every boundary I tried to set was trampled by parents, who worshipped at her altar of narcissism. Now, 3 days before my wedding, the ultimate betrayal landed with a phone call that shattered the fragile remaining pieces of my heart. My father's voice, usually cold and detached, carried a strange, dismissive edge as he informed me he would not be walking me down the aisle. He claimed that Clara felt his presence by my side would somehow upset her delicate, emotional state. My mother, following his lead like a loyal soldier, didn't even try to soften the blow. She simply told me to walk alone and stop creating unnecessary drama. I stared at the blank wall, listening to the dial tone, realizing that the facade of a supportive family had finally crumbled into dust. The pain was sharp, but beneath the hurt a cold, hard resolve began to crystallize within my soul. I was no longer the girl waiting for crumbs of affection. I was a woman who had finally opened her eyes to the toxicity surrounding her. I realized that my wedding day was not about their approval or their narrow-minded sense of duty. It was the threshold of my new life, and I would dictate who walked beside me into that future. I hung up the phone, and for the first time in my life, I felt a strange sense of liberation. The silence in the room was no longer lonely. It was the quiet preparation for a storm that would change everything. They expected me to be a victim, to show up trembling and diminished, but they didn't know the woman I had become in the quiet darkness. I looked at my reflection and saw a stranger, a survivor ready to dismantle the lies they had built. The stage was set, the script was being rewritten, and I was holding the pen, ready to craft an ending that would leave them speechless. I began to make the calls that would ensure my walk down that aisle would be an absolute reckoning, a moment of profound transformation that they could never erase from their memories. The countdown had begun, and the air crackled with the heavy, electric promise of the coming collision between their fragile, manipulative world and my newfound unshakable strength. The remaining 48 hours before the ceremony felt like a blur of cold, calculated movements, a stark departure from the frantic, people-pleasing energy I used to radiate. I spent hours alone, reflecting on the decades I had spent molding myself to fit into the cracks of a family that never truly cared for my existence. Every time I had succeeded, it was an inconvenience. Every time I had struggled, it was a nuisance. My father's casual cruelty was not a sudden event, but the final stroke on a portrait of systemic neglect that had been painted for years. I didn't reach out to my mother or Clara, nor did I demand an apology. That would surely be hollow or twisted to make me the villain. Instead, I focused my entire energy on the logistics of my vengeance, which felt more like a cleansing ritual than a scheme. I had secured the services of an old mentor, a retired judge who had once seen the potential in me when my own parents had ignored it. He was the one who had guided me through the darkest years of my career, providing the kind of paternal wisdom that my father had never possessed. When I asked him to take that place at my side, he didn't even hesitate, his voice filled with a warmth that made my chest ache with gratitude. He understood that this act was not about petty revenge, but about reclaiming the dignity that I had been denied for so long. We worked through the final details in the quiet of his study, the smell of old books and coffee, providing a sanctuary from the chaos of my family's expectations. I was not just planning a walk. I was orchestrating a powerful display of truth that would strip away the lies my parents had curated for the benefit of their social circle. The weight of the secret grew heavier with each passing hour, but it was a good kind of burden, one that fueled my determination. I spent the night before the wedding refining the guest list and ensuring that every person who truly mattered to me would be there to witness the shift in power. My dress hung in the corner like a silent sentinel, a symbol of the beauty I had cultivated from the debris of my past. I slept soundly, knowing that when I woke up, the old Adisa would be gone, replaced by someone who understood exactly what she was worth. The sun would rise on a new era, and for the first time, I wouldn't be walking toward a life dictated by someone else's terms, but into a future that belonged entirely to me and the people who actually loved me. The morning of the wedding dawned with a clarity that seemed to mock the years of fog I had endured. I woke before the alarm, watching the golden light creep across my bedroom floor, feeling an eerie, absolute stillness in my heart. There was no pre-wedding anxiety, no fluttering nerves about the ceremony itself, only a focused, laser-like intent to execute the plan that would finally break my family's iron grip on my identity. I dressed in silence, avoiding the frantic calls from my mother's phone that had begun buzzing at 6, their screens flashing with demands that I come to her room to help Clara with her hair. I ignored every single notification, blocking them one by one, watching the digital cord snap away as if I were performing surgery on a diseased part of my soul. Each blocked number felt like shedding a layer of lead, lightening my spirit for the day ahead. I looked at the mirror and practiced the expression I would wear. Calm, untouchable, and utterly resolute. My hair was pulled back perfectly, my makeup a shield of neutral tones that emphasized the strength in my jawline, rather than the softness they had always tried to enforce. The house was quiet, a stark contrast to the volatile household I had escaped years ago. I felt like a spy in my own life, preparing for the mission that would define my future. My mentor arrived exactly on time, looking dignified and steady, his presence alone acting as a barricade against the impending intrusion of my parents' expectations. We didn't speak much. We didn't need to, as our shared understanding bridged any gaps in communication. He offered his arm, and I took it, feeling the solid, grounding texture of his suit jacket beneath my fingertips. This was not a replacement for a father. It was a testament to the fact that I had built my own support system when I was left to rot. I knew that in a few hours the doors of the church would swing open, and the facade they had labored so hard to maintain would collapse under the weight of the truth. The world would see them not as the pillars of the community they pretended to be, but as the architects of their own isolation. I gathered my things and headed toward the door, not looking back at the past, stepping into the waiting car that would take me toward the most beautiful, honest moment of my entire life. The ride to the chapel was a passage through time, each mile taking me further away from the girl who used to cry in the basement while her sister played with expensive toys upstairs. I watched the cityscape change, the familiar neighborhood of my childhood giving way to the scenic, tree-lined path that led to the wedding venue. Every shadow on the road felt like a ghost from my past, whispering doubts about my worth, but I brushed them away as easily as I would dust off my shoulder. The judge kept his eyes on the road, occasionally glancing at me with a smile that conveyed immense pride, an expression I had rarely received from my own bloodkin. He knew exactly what this ceremony meant, not just as a marriage to the wonderful man waiting for me at the altar, but as a public divorce from the toxicity that had strangled my growth for decades. I felt the ring on my finger, a reminder of the partner who had stood by me when I was at my lowest, someone who never asked me to be smaller or quieter for the sake of his comfort. My parents were already there, likely busy spreading a narrative about my supposed emotional instability, preparing the guests to see me walk down the aisle alone and perhaps a bit pathetic. I could almost hear my mother's voice dripping with faux concern, telling the aunts and cousins how she tried to reach me, but I refused to listen. They were so confident in their manipulation that they hadn't once considered that I might have outgrown their petty games. As we turned into the parking lot, I saw their luxury cars glinting in the morning sun, parked side by side like sentinels of a regime that was about to fall. I felt a surge of adrenaline, not of fear, but of an impending, glorious release. The battle was not about winning an argument. It was about exposing the truth through a single, undeniable action. I took a deep breath, the air filling my lungs, with the scent of lilies and the ozone of a gathering storm. My mentor slowed the car to a stop, turned to me, and held out his hand once more. I accepted it, feeling the pulse of my own power drumming in my veins, ready to step out and let the world see the woman they thought they could discard like trash. We entered through the side entrance, moving quickly through the dimly lit vestry, while the murmur of the gathering crowd drifted through the heavy oak doors. I could hear the organist practicing a soft, melodic tune that felt like a prelude to a revolution. My bridesmaids were waiting, their faces a mix of nervousness and fierce loyalty, having been briefed on the change of plans only hours before. When they saw me, they didn't offer the pitying looks I had feared. Instead, they burst into genuine smiles, surrounding me with a protective circle that felt stronger than any family bond I had ever known. They understood the significance of this moment, having listened to my stories of abandonment and gaslighting over bottles of wine during the long, painful months of planning. My mother, oblivious to our presence, was likely in the lobby greeting guests with that practiced, insincere smile that used to make my skin crawl. I imagined the scene clearly, her adjusting her dress, complaining about my lack of cooperation, and positioning herself to be the center of attention as she always did. She probably thought I was in the bridal room, cowering and regretting my decision to stand up for myself. The irony was suffocating. She viewed my boundaries as defiance, never realizing that she had forced my hand by refusing to treat me as a daughter, worthy of respect. I felt a pang of sadness for her, for the limited, bitter life she had chosen, but it was quickly replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. This was not just my wedding. It was the funeral of the old, broken Adisa. I adjusted my veil, feeling the weight of the lace against my skin, and looked at the clock. We had 5 minutes before the ceremony started. The tension in the room was palpable, vibrating in the very air, but it was not the frantic energy of a disaster. It was the hum of a controlled detonation. I looked at my mentor, who stood like a rock amidst the swirling motion of the women dressing and primping. He was the anchor I needed to stay grounded before the final act of this long overdue script. Everything was aligned, every player in place, and for the first time in 32 years, I was the one directing the symphony of my own existence, ready to step out and let the music play for me. The heavy doors groaned as the organ swelled into the opening notes of the processional, signaling that the moment of truth had finally arrived. I stood just inside the threshold, the air cool and smelling of beeswax and ancient wood, while my mentor tightened his grip on my arm. My heart was not racing with anxiety. It was beating with a steady, powerful cadence that echoed the strength I had cultivated in isolation. Beyond those doors, my mother and father were seated in the front row, probably preparing to witness me walk alone, a spectacle they had likely framed as a cautionary tale of a daughter who didn't know her place. I could imagine the whispers, the judgmental glares from relatives, who had only ever heard my family's version of reality. They expected to see a broken woman, a victim of her own supposed poor judgment, and they were ready to feast on that narrative. But as the usher signaled that the way was clear, I felt the sheer electricity of the shift we were about to cause. I didn't care about their stares or their whispered criticisms. I cared only about the steps I was about to take. Each step was a brick in the wall I was building against their influence, a testament to the fact that I no longer required their permission to exist or to be loved. I looked ahead, catching a glimpse of the altar, where the man I adored was waiting, his eyes bright with a love that had nothing to do with bloodlines and everything to do with character. He was the one who had seen the scars they left and chose to kiss them rather than hide them. The transition from the shadows of my past to the light of this altar felt like surfacing from a deep, cold ocean into the warmth of the sun. I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey, for the pain that had refined me, and for the man beside me who had become the silent guardian of my future. I was no longer an accessory in their show. I was the star of my own. And as the doors began to creak open to reveal the sea of faces, I prepared myself to walk into the world as a woman fully claimed by her own truth. As the massive doors swung wide, the initial wave of sound from the crowd, a mixture of polite chatter and expectant gasps, abruptly died down into a heavy, suffocating silence. I stepped forward, not with the hesitant shuffle of someone seeking approval, but with the measured, deliberate pace of a woman reclaiming her throne. The light from the stained glass windows caught the intricate lace of my gown, making it seem as though I were walking through a veil of liquid gold. I saw them immediately. My mother's mouth fell open, her carefully curated expression of pity instantly fracturing into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. My father sat frozen, his hand gripping the edge of the pew so tightly that his knuckles turned a ghostly white, his eyes darting frantically between me and the man beside me. They hadn't expected to see a judge, a man of such stature and reputation, holding my arm with such protective, grandfatherly pride. The whispers that rippled through the pews were not of judgment against me, but of confusion and awe at the scene unfolding before them. I kept my chin high, my gaze locked firmly on the altar, ignoring the stinging curiosity in the room, as if it were nothing more than background static. Every step I took felt like a declaration of independence, a rhythmic thumping against the floor that signaled the end of their authority over my life. The air felt charged, humming with the weight of hidden truths being dragged into the bright, uncompromising light of day. People who had once looked down on me now shifted in their seats, their faces illuminated by the sudden realization that the narrative they had been fed was a brittle lie. I felt the surge of my own internal fire, a burning, relentless heat that chased away the last lingering chill of childhood neglect. I wasn't just walking to an altar, I was walking away from a legacy of trauma, leaving it behind with every graceful, iron-willed stride toward a future that was finally, unequivocally mine to shape and define on my own terms. I could feel the intensity of my mother's gaze burning into the side of my face, a desperate, clawing look that usually forced me to apologize or shrink into the background. For 32 years, that look had been a tether, pulling me back whenever I dared to explore the world beyond her narrow definitions of success and failure. Today, however, that tether was severed, and I felt nothing but a cool, detached indifference. The weight of her disapproval, once so crushing that it kept me awake for days, was now as light as a dead leaf, utterly insignificant in the face of the life I had built for myself. As we passed her row, I caught a glimpse of my sister Clara, her face twisted in a sneer of pure jealousy that she wasn't the center of this sudden, dramatic shift in focus. She had expected me to arrive in tears, to stumble through the ceremony as a broken, lonely figure, and the sight of me looking composed, radiant, and supported by a respected figure of authority had clearly unraveled her composure. It was a beautiful, chaotic moment of clarity, a silent admission that their power was entirely built upon my willingness to play the victim. By simply refusing to participate in their drama, I had effectively rendered their entire script obsolete. The judge gave my hand a gentle, reassuring squeeze, as if sensing the internal shift and confirming that I was doing exactly the right thing. The atmosphere in the church had transformed from a standard, boring wedding affair into a high-stakes arena of truth, where the illusions of the past were being systematically dismantled by the simple act of standing tall. Every guest in the room could feel the tectonic plates of my family dynamic shifting. And for once, the spotlight wasn't on the people who had tried to dim it, but on the one who had finally decided to burn brighter than their shadows ever could. I continued my walk, heart steady and head held high, knowing that the most difficult part of the transition was behind me, and that the path ahead was completely, joyfully my own. The final stretch of the aisle felt like a bridge crossing over into a new dimension of existence, one where I was the architect of my own peace. My groom reached out his hand, his eyes shimmering with tears, and the sight of his devotion served as the final confirmation that I had made the right choice in distancing myself from those who only knew how to take. As I reached the altar, I didn't glance back at my parents, who were now essentially invisible to me, lost in the sea of guests who were busy whispering about this unexpected twist. I felt a profound sense of closure, as if the last chapter of my book of sorrows had been permanently closed, the pages sealed by the weight of this public declaration. The officiant began the ceremony, his voice steady and warm, but I barely registered the words because the internal victory was so loud it drowned out everything else. I was standing in the exact spot I was meant to be, surrounded by friends who were chosen family and a partner who cherished my soul. The air in the sanctuary seemed to lighten, shifting from the heavy, stagnant pressure of old secrets to the vibrant, crisp promise of a brand new day. I was no longer defined by the rejection I had faced at home, but by the love I had cultivated in the gardens of my own independence. It was a surreal, almost intoxicating feeling to realize that I had transformed from the girl who apologized for existing into a woman who commanded respect just by showing up. Every fiber of my being resonated with the truth that resilience is not just about enduring pain. It is about refusing to let that pain become your final destination. I stood there, bathed in the light of the tall windows, feeling the warmth of the sun on my skin and the solid reality of my future beside me, knowing that the chains of my past had been snapped like twigs under the weight of my newfound confidence and the strength of the life I had built. Throughout the vows, a deep, resonant calm settled over me, replacing the remaining echoes of my mother's voice that used to haunt my quietest moments. Every promise I made to my husband was a rejection of the toxic patterns I had witnessed as a child, a sacred pledge to foster growth, honesty, and mutual support instead of manipulation and control. I watched his face as he spoke, seeing not just a partner, but a witness to my transformation, a person who had seen me fight my way out of the darkness and decided to walk beside me into the light. The congregation remained uncharacteristically still, captivated by the raw sincerity of the exchange, the palpable difference between the performative life my family demanded and the authentic life I was now claiming. I felt a surge of triumph, not because I had humiliated my parents, but because I had succeeded in spite of them, proving that a person's value is inherent and cannot be diminished by the cruelty of those who fail to recognize it. My father remained in his seat, looking diminished. The power he once wielded over me, now clearly eroded by the sheer force of my refusal to be defined by his disapproval. It was not a moment of hate, but of profound indifference. I was finally free from the need for his validation, the most significant barrier I had ever faced. The ceremony concluded with a sense of finality that felt like the snapping of a lock on a heavy iron gate. I had walked down that aisle not as a daughter of disappointment, but as a queen of her own domain, surrounded by a court of people who truly valued the person I had become through fire. The transition was complete. The narrative had been rewritten, and I was stepping into the next phase of my life with a heart that was whole, unbroken, and ready to embrace a future that was entirely of my own making and filled with a love that had never known the sting of betrayal. As we walked back up the aisle, the reality of my new life settled over me like a warm, protective cloak. I saw my mother clutching her handbag, her knuckles white, her face a mixture of confusion and rage that I had dared to bypass her control so effectively. She looked small, almost inconsequential, as if the massive ego she had once projected had finally collapsed under the weight of her own hubris. I didn't stop to offer a polite nod or an explanation. I kept moving, my arm linked firmly with my husband's, our pace steady and unapologetic. We stepped out of the church doors and into the bright, blinding afternoon sun, the world suddenly feeling vast and full of infinite, untapped possibilities. My friends and mentors crowded around us, their laughter and well wishes acting as a barrier against the encroaching toxicity of the people I was leaving behind for good. I felt the sharp, clean air against my skin, a stark reminder that I was breathing on my own terms now, untainted by the smog of familial obligation. There would be no follow-up conversations with my father, no explanations from my mother, and no apologies to my sister. The bridge was not just burned. It was never there to begin with. I turned to look at the chapel one last time, seeing it as the graveyard of my former self, and felt nothing but an overwhelming sense of relief. I had survived the storm, navigated the wreckage of my childhood, and emerged on the other side with a heart that had learned to beat for itself. The path ahead was winding and unknown, but it was mine. And for the first time in 32 years, I possessed the tools to navigate it without asking for permission, without seeking approval, and without ever looking back at the shadows that had tried to consume my light. The reception was a jubilant celebration of chosen family, a radiant banquet where every toast and every laugh felt like a victory lap over the ghosts of my past. As I stood on the dance floor, watching the people who actually loved me, the ones who had shown up when it mattered, I realized that my transformation was not just a temporary state, but a permanent recalibration of my soul. I was no longer the girl seeking crumbs. I was a woman who had built her own feast. My parents' absence from the celebration was not a loss, but a quiet, necessary subtraction that made the equation of my life perfectly balanced. The tragedy of their choice became the bedrock of my resilience, a lesson in who I was truly meant to be. When the external pressure was finally removed, I felt stronger, more capable, and infinitely more capable of deep, lasting joy than I ever could have imagined while living under their shadow. My justice was not a scream, but this beautiful, unshakable peace. Life is far too short to remain a prisoner of your own bloodline, and today I finally stepped into the truth that you are allowed to choose the people who deserve your time, your love, and your presence. This is the ultimate lesson in survival. Never let someone else hold the key to your self-worth. If you have ever felt like the shadow in your own family, remember that you are capable of stepping into the light, of walking your own path, and of building a life that speaks for itself. My journey from a neglected victim to a confident, empowered woman proves that the best way to move past betrayal is to simply thrive in the life you have, painstakingly created for yourself. If this story of reclaiming your identity resonated with you, show your support for the power of chosen family and the courage it takes to leave toxicity behind. Like and subscribe to join this journey of transformation, and stay tuned for more stories about building the life you were always meant to live.